So environmental risk assessments won't just focus on rodenticide. It will take into other things that you may use, such as traps. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're mainly going to be talking about rodenticides. And as Alex mentioned, these are commonly known as AVKs, or anti-vitamin K agents. And that crops up quite a lot. So if you see AVKs and it's a new term to you, it basically means anti-vitamin K. Now, all AVKs are persistent, so meaning that we are continuously using them. So it's something that we have as a tool and we're continuously using them, so they're always present. They are bioaccumulative, which basically means that they build up in the animal's tissue and they have quite a long half-life, so they'll remain in that animal's tissue for a long period of time. And they are toxic to all birds and mammals. Now, because of these, they are candidates for substitution. Now, this basically means that if there is an alternative that works just as good, then rodenticides could be removed because there is an alternative that may be safer and works just as good as the rodenticides that we currently have. And that is reviewed on a regular basis. Now, we're all aware that AVKs are hazardous and the risk that they pose to primary and secondary poison in non-targets. This could be non-target wildlife or even non-target environments such as ponds and rivers. And these places could also then become contaminated through AVKs present in that environment. You think of a river, if you're using rodenticides nearby, that river floods, that rodenticide then may end up in the river. And these are things that we need to be mindful of when we're looking at environmental risk assessments. Every time we use a rodenticide, it is a substance that we are using that could pose a risk, so we need to be careful with it. And because of this, if we are using AVKs, then we should be carrying out an environmental risk assessment every time to assess these dangers, and we need to implement any risk mitigation measures, I can't speak, to prevent these products being a risk to that environment. So primary poisoning, this is where something consumes the bait directly. So if you have bait outside and it's eaten by something like a songbird, that is then primary poisoned by that product. And as I said before, rodenticides could have an effect on all birds and mammals. Yeah, it can get into that stream in a number of different ways. And bait that finds its way into a watercourse could also be consumed by fish, and it could have an issue in that aquatic environment as well. Secondary poisoning, this is where something consumes the bait, such as a wood mouse, and then a predator bird then eats said wood mouse. So your primary poison is the wood mouse, the secondary poison is that predator bird. Now, because AVKs are all persistent in the body and they will bioaccumulate in the food chain, so if something eats, like a mouse eats it and then a predator bird eats it, that AVK will be passed on in the food chain. Don't forget about things like slugs, snails, and insects. They can also eat the bait, and then they can be consumed by hedgehogs and other songbirds. And it's been seen that birds of prey that mainly feed on songbirds have had residues of rodenticide, and I've got a list a little bit later on that highlights that. Now, the effects on non-targets can be extensive, and because we've been using these chemicals for a little over 50 years now, there has been data collected over a long period of time, and it shows that there are a variety of species that have been affected by AVKs. There was a report done in 2013, and it showed that there was a top 10 species list of non-targets that had consumed AVKs, and that contained things like buzzards, red kites, dogs, foxes, cats, badgers, barn owls, sparrowhawks, peregrines, and crows. They were the top 10 species that were affected. Now, we need to be mindful of this because any residue levels that are found are obviously not good. And we need to make sure that them residue levels are being reduced through the stewardship scheme. And this will hopefully mean that we don't have any more restrictions on products that we're using. If them residues don't reduce and the stewardship scheme needs to be tightened, then them changes may come into effect. And as we've seen, even over the last since 2015, 2016, we have had implementation in changes that has affected the products that we are using. Now, the lowest risk treatment is obviously going to be one that's indoors, say a treatment for house mice in an urban situation. That's going to be quite low risk, as Alex mentioned earlier. And then high risk treatments are going to be things like around buildings, treating for rats in a rural setting. And they're obviously going to have a higher risk of non-targets present in that environment. And you'll need to look out sort of the areas you are working, especially if it's urban, suburban, or rural. Just be mindful of wildlife that you may expect to see in them areas. I always say to people, like, know your environment. Like, up near us, we don't have many red kites, but if I go an hour down the road towards Harrogate, they have quite a high level of red kites in that area. So just knowing where you're working as to what animals you're likely to come into contact with will give you a good idea on what you're looking for when you're carrying out an environmental risk assessment. Don't forget your treatment factors, and you need to look at how much issues the site has had in the past, but also the potential of a reinfestation. So if the potential of a reinfestation is high, you may need to take other measures to prevent that from being a problem in the future. And again, don't forget to look for areas such as watercourses. So why do we need to bother? We need to prevent non-target poisoning incidents, and we also need to minimize or reduce the levels of residues that are found in non-target species. As I mentioned, stewardship is there to monitor this, and hopefully the system that's put into place will reduce those residue levels through this guidance and training that's provided. And stewardship doesn't always put restrictions on products. Sometimes it changes things for the better. So for a long time, single feed baits had certain requirements on them, and that requirement was changed, which obviously then helped with resistance. So where we could use single feed baits changed, and that helped us with dealing with resistance. If, as it's happened, that residues are continuously staying the same, then as has happened this year, this training has come in that we need to get 3 CPD points a year to hopefully keep people up to date and then reduce them levels even further. And as pest controllers, it's been well known that from the introduction of the stewardship scheme, that we've taken that on board and worked with it very well, and everyone is very aware of it and what we need to do. Okay, this is just a slide on why we need to environmental risk assessments. And in 2011, the pest controller was prosecuted for a dead fox that contained AVKs, and the charges were related to improper use of AVKs as well. They were actually charged with failing to produce an environmental risk assessment, and that was how they ended up in court and the charges that were created for that improper use. Now, anytime, whether it's on your site or nearby, if an animal does die and it's suspected of rodenticide poisoning or it's suspected of having residues of rodenticide poisoning, they will carry out a post-mortem. If it is found to contain rodenticides, then they can tell which rodenticides are actually present, and then they'll start to investigate and try and work out how them rodenticides got into that non-target. And like I say, doesn't have to die of a rodenticide poisoning. It may be that it's died of something else like an RTA, and then they've suspected that it might contain rodenticides and they've tested it. Now, if you have an ERA in place, this will show that you've been due diligent, and it hopefully will mitigate any risk to non-targets within that ERA, so your treatment will be correct. Should that incident happen, they'll come look at your ERA, realize that you're doing your job properly, and then they will look at other places where there may be an issue with rodenticide use. Now, CRRU alone test around 100 barn owls a year, and this is monitoring residue levels, and that's just one organization. When you look at the data, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of autopsies taking place all over the UK, and these are carried out by individual groups or organizations, and they also are looking for residue levels. If you ever look at the data, you will see that from about 2003, there was a sort of a big increase in rodenticides found in non-target species. And that was because in that time period, they started looking at animals that had died from other causes, but they still collected the data if they contained rodenticide within them. It wasn't just on animals that were dying of rodenticide poisoning. So that graph does look a little bit skewy, but just remember that they are looking at residues no matter how the animal died. So why do barn owls use, and why do CRRU use barn owls? We've got a lot of data on barn owls over a long period of time, and there's been residue testing on barn owls for the last 35 years. Now, because we've got really good data on it, it does make it possible that over a period of time, we can assess that data and make sure that changes are happening. In 2022, there was 88 barn owls that were sampled, and it showed that 79.5% had detected liver residues of one or more second-generation anticoagulant. Now, the high levels of contamination does suggest that there's still gross misuse of AVK products, and the HSE want to see a significant reduction in this. And like I say, barn owls is being used to show that, so we need to be making sure that we're following the stewardship regime to reduce them levels. Now, currently, CRRU, like I say, are testing around 100 barn owls a year for analysis, and these are not all dying from rodenticide use. Like I mentioned earlier, it may be something like an RTA, or they've died of other natural causes. They've been found, and then they will be tested. To get a good picture, that 100 number is about right, so that they need to test around 100. If they have a lot less, obviously, it skews the figures, so that they need around 100 barn owls a year for testing. Now, if you're not aware of it, there was an updated CRRU code that came out in 2024, and in that code, it states that ERA should be carried out. Now, failing to do so does mean that you are failing to follow stewardship. And if you are ever unsure or you need to find the code of best practice because you've not got it, if you go to the Think Wildlife website, there's a tab that says downloads. In there, you'll have all the forms that you need, whether it's an environmental risk assessment form or you need the code of best practice. And there are various other documents on there as well, should you wish to have a look through it. But for any information on CRRU related things, if you go to the Think Wildlife website, that's where you're going to find all the information. Also happens to be the place that if you want to do tail sample testing, it has all the information on there as well. Now, hopefully you've all seen this environmental risk assessment form. I know there are a variety of different options that people are using. And obviously for things like a digital system, you may have created your own form within that digital system, but ultimately the information that needs to be collected stays the same. You can download this document as well at the Think Wildlife website, like I mentioned, and it has been developed by industry experts and other industry stakeholders, including the government departments. And it's been accepted by the HSE as the industry standard environmental risk assessment. So they're happy that this works, and if it's used properly, it will mitigate the measures that we're putting in place, and it'll also allow us as pest controllers to say why we're actually using them products or carrying out that treatment in that environment. It should be used at all sites where there is a risk to the environment from rodenticides, and you should be documenting it, which I will talk a little bit about in a minute. Before you fill out an ERA, you'll need to conduct a site survey. Now, this document is normally in a report form, so you'll carry out a site survey as a report. It will need to have a unique reference number. Commonly, site visit reports do have a unique reference number. If yours don't, you'll need to create one. And that unique reference number will be used on things like the ERA form further down the line. If there is significant risk to the environment from your proposed treatment, if that is a yes, then you need to complete an ERA. If there isn't a significant risk from your treatment, then you need to document reasons why you are not completing the ERA. And again, that would just go in your normal site survey report. Now, in your survey, you're going to need to consider a number of things, such as the extent of the infestation. You're going to need to look at what non-targets are present, and you will need to list what they could be. And you're going to also need to look at any non-target environments. Is it near a river or a pond, that sort of thing? Are you near a forest line? You'll need to establish them areas of risk and put that in your report as well. Now, using rodenticides is obviously going to pose a risk to that environment, so you need to look at, is that the best treatment? And you need to look at whether primary or secondary poisoning is also a risk, and make sure that is accounted for in your survey. And then you need to record that survey, and it should form part of your evidence. Like I say, if you have a unique reference number, you can attach that unique reference number to your environmental risk assessment, and them two things will go together. It means that you don't have to write it twice. You basically carry out your site survey, fill out the information, then you carry out your environmental risk assessment, and that information will cross. You'll need to know if there's any current infestations or if there's a likelihood of a future infestation. Thinking of places like warehousing and locations, if they are going to carry out some building work, maybe build a new warehouse, that may be a future risk. Any outdoor treatments where you're going to use AVKs would result in a risk to the environment, and only indoor treatments would have a very low risk. You need to think about the significance of that risk, and especially looking at humans and animals that may be at risk from you carrying out that treatment. And you need to make sure that you're planning, especially if you're looking at things like permanent baiting, you need to make sure that you are following the guidance for permanent baiting from the CRRU document. And that comes up in your environmental risk assessment, so you will need to know about that. So if you are looking at doing permanent baiting because there may be a high risk of future infestations, you need to make sure that the CRRU document is covered and that you're carrying out all the steps that they require you to. Now, in recent years, there's been some changes in product labels. Previously, it used to say for control of rats and mice. That's now been changed, and it will have a specific scientific name for the actual pest that you can treat with it, and that is going to be on the product label. For Field mice and wood mice, there is no AVKs, there's no products, there's no AVK product with them on the label, and the only other active ingredient that is on it is a product that contains cholecalciferol. So you just need to make sure that you're using the correct product for the correct species, which means if you're using an AVK to treat field mice or wood mice, it's actually illegal. Just be mindful of that. Obviously, the identification of species is very important. Wood mice are commonly grey with a grey belly. Sorry, house mice are commonly grey with a grey belly, whereas wood mice are going to be brown with a white fur belly, and they're normally quite clean white fur looking. And house mice are predominantly going to be living indoors. You should be able to tell the difference between species, whether it's mice activity or rat activity, and you should be able to spot the signs that would indicate which one you are treating for. Mice activity externally or external to a building is more than likely always going to be wood mice, and therefore you shouldn't be using AVKs for treating mice outside. And mice activity internally, you need to make sure, obviously, you're ruling out bats from this, checking the droppings. If you suspect it's bats, then you need to go down a different path. But if it is mouse droppings, it could be wood mouse or house mouse. And in the first instance, you should be using traps on that site to work out what species you actually have before using rodenticides. Now, the risk hierarchy, I know Alex mentioned it earlier, it is a key concept of the CRRU Code of Best Practice, and you should understand it and how to use that in your integrated pest management approach. It's likely that not every treatment, non-toxic methods will work alone, but you may need to use them in conjunction with other rodenticides. The important thing is that it's an integrated pest management approach, so you're not just using one thing, you're using a range of chemical and non-chemical control measures to your best ability to control that infestation. AVKs are not always the first option and should only be considered when other methods alone will not work. And rodenticides should all be used in conjunction with other things such as environmental changes and trapping. You will need to record what non-toxic options you are using. So in your report, don't just record your toxic options, always record your non-toxic options that you're using. And make sure that in your report, you're putting things like housekeeping and proofing requirements and any hygiene changes that need to be made on site. Now, if these steps are not possible or appropriate, you'll also need to document that. So if you go to a site and you're carrying out a treatment and something isn't appropriate, make sure that you're documenting why it's not appropriate. You'll need to explain why you're using other toxic methods. So looking at products like alpha chlorulose, it is for indoor use only. If you are not going to use it, you may need to record why you're not going to use it. Some might be obvious, like alpha chlorulose, you can't use it outside because the product label says so. But also think about things like phosphine gas. There are obviously specific requirements around phosphine gas, and only certain people can use it in certain environments. You need to look at the risk from pests. So is there a significant risk to humans or animals from a rodent infestation? You will need to document and justify that on your ERA. You need to look at the risk, who it is a risk to, and make sure you are documenting it. If there is no significant risk to people or animals, as it says there, think again, you're probably not likely to be able to use rodenticide. Now, somewhere in the region of 20 years ago, permanent baiting in external areas was common practice. Can you justify that nowadays with a higher risk that it pose, especially in rural environments? Can you justify using permanent baiting? You will need to also remember to comply with product labels. There's been some label changes recently. You need to make sure that you comply with them product label changes on what products you are using. Permanent baiting used to be a norm, but these days it should only be used in exceptional circumstances. And I said there is CRRU guidance on permanent baiting. One of the reasons that was highlighted in the survey that they did at the start of when CRRU was sort of coming together was what is actually causing a risk. What have we changed in the last few years that is now allowing rodenticides to be more prevalent in the environment? And one of the things that had changed was the use of permanent baiting on contracts. So that was highlighted as a thing that we need to reduce and change that behavior, which is why the guidance on permanent baiting is in the CRRU guidance and it should be followed. You'll need to gather information on your site. So you need to look at protected species or high conservation areas. You'll also need to know if it is a site of special scientific interest, or if you're working near places like nature reserves. You can find this information on local wildlife trust websites, and there are some government websites that also have information around these sort of protected areas. In terms of products, you will need to know what products that you are using. So you'll need to know all the information about them, things like product name, active ingredients, concentrations. They will have an authorization number, which is also required in your report. So if you're using an AVK, make sure you're putting all that information into your report and how much you are using of it. Make sure you are following the product label and you only use that product. The whole product label is the legal requirement. I know sometimes it gets confused that there's a statutory box. That's not the case. The whole product label is your legal requirement. So you need to make sure you're following all the steps on there. And you need to know what species you are able to treat with that product and be able to identify that you're actually treating the correct species from the start of your treatment. Don't forget that the RA is your due diligence in defense of a court of law. So you do need to complete them and make sure that you have them available. And make sure that you provide enough detail in them that shows that you've taken necessary steps to prevent contamination in the environment. So make sure that you're putting enough information in there to show that you're doing it correctly and that what you're doing is not going to affect something from carrying out that treatment. Now, things you should do, you need to record all likely risks of animals on that site. And you need to record what steps you take to reduce the risk of non-targets, especially if you're thinking about introducing a rodenticide to that site. Make sure you include things like non-toxic products that you're going to use. If you are going to use alternative toxic products, Alex mentioned a few of those earlier. Reduce the time of rodenticides on site. So only having rodenticides on site while you're carrying out a treatment. Once that treatment has been completed, you can then remove them rodenticides. Maybe you need to restrict access to them rodenticides, especially from things like non-targets, and only use rodenticides in areas where you require them. And like I say, you'll get all this information when you carry out your site survey. We need to make sure that we're looking for rodent carcasses. If you look at the product labels now, it will suggest that you check for rodent carcasses as often as you check for the bait that you're putting down. This may need to be done more frequently. So if you've got a site that's heavily infested, it may be that you need to go to that site more frequently just to make sure that you are checking for them carcasses that may be out there. Don't forget that other things like foxes or scavenger birds may come and feed on them carcasses. So we should be checking for them on a regular basis. You'll also need to dispose those carcasses safely. Make sure it's in a manner that follows the waste procedure that you have, or you are using someone that's authorized to get rid of that waste. Domestic waste could be in a domestic waste collection, but you need to make sure that's agreed with the local authority, so they need to be aware of it. Some farms may have small carcass incinerators. Again, if it's an option used, just make sure that you are documenting that you are using it. And if you're disposing of any rodents on a site, it needs to be in line with any sort of local government agencies. So they may have their own things in place, and there may be procedures that you may need to take if you're disposing of rodents on a site. Now, a little bit on waste. If you work in the pest control industry, you should already have a waste carrier's license. If you don't have a waste carrier's license, go to the government website. There is a list of questions, so you just go through the questions. Normally, pest controllers fit into that lower tier category, which is a free category, and they will then give you a certificate. Make sure you keep that number safe on your certificate, as you will need it in the future. There has been incidences where commercial businesses have been stopped by the police, and because it's a commercial business, anything that's classed as waste within that vehicle will need to be covered, or it will be covered under your waste carrier's license, and they'll just ask you for your waste carrier's license code. So just make sure you have it handy. A lot of people I know just print it out and put it on the bulkhead of the van. It's always there, or put it in a folder that you have in the van. It's probably the best place for it. Don't forget that waste is only waste when it can no longer be used. If you can reuse something, then do. If you can't reuse something, then it needs to be disposed of as hazardous waste, and make sure you are following the correct EWC code, and then you're disposing that product by a licensed waste disposal contractor, and you have that documentation. So you always need to keep documentation as to the movement of waste. The only difference for pest control is for one of the movements, so from site to your store, you wouldn't pay for it, but then the other movement, you may need to pay for it. So you just need to have documentation of all of that, and as long as you've got that documentation, you will be fine on waste. So conclusions on this. I think I'm on time. Good. Can this treatment safely proceed once you have collected all the information and have made an informed decision? So once you've carried out your site survey, can that treatment then proceed as you have planned? You'll need to make sure that you justify using rodenticides and document this on your environmental risk assessment. Like I said, there are a number of environmental risk assessment options out there, whether you're using a digital system, but the CRRU one is on their website. You can download it, and it's got some information in there that you'll need to provide and fill out that form. We are currently, so the BPCA is currently doing some work on environmental risk assessments, and hopefully in sort of the next few weeks, we'll have some information that we can send out that will help you filling out environmental risk assessments. So stay tuned for that. Don't forget that this is a balancing act, so you need to protect the health of human beings and animals, but we also need to minimize the impact on the environment. So we just need to make sure that what we're doing is done in a safe way. We are controlling pests for the right reasons and not putting anything in the environment that's going to cause harm to non-targets. And only you can decide on the best approach, but just make sure it's an informed decision and you write it down. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, AVKs are a significant hazard to the environment, and every time we use them, it is a potential risk to that local environment. Make sure you're considering all non-targets that could be at risk and what you need to do to reduce that risk. And don't forget to produce that ERA. Make sure that it's got all the information in it because it will form part of your due diligence. That's me. Thank you very much. These presentations, like I say, are available on the Think Wildlife website. You can deliver them to your teams. We at the BPCA will also be producing things for BPCA members where you'll be able to get access to them. And like I said, that CPD tab is available on the BPCA registered CPD scheme. So if you are doing any CRRU related training, you can go onto there and register it yourself. If it is a registered course with us that we're already doing, we'll already have that information, so the points should be added automatically.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, John.
That was good timing.
It was really good timing. I know you were like slightly concerned about running over.
I had a lot to go through.
You and Alex both finished with 2 minutes to spare, so I absolutely think that's a win. I am going to hold on to you for a couple more minutes though, because we do have loads of questions coming in. If that's all right,
I'll try and get through as many as we can. Yep.
Absolutely. So we've got one from Rosie Bryan as well. So Rosie's asking, is an ERA needed when baiting inside a domestic roof space / house?
It is needed. You just need to check on the location that you are working in, whether it is documented and how you need to document it. That is the only sort of difference. Like I said at the start, as pest controllers, we're really good at carrying out environmental assessments. And I think we get a little bit bogged down sometimes that something that we do naturally and we're very good at it, it's recording it. And it's that bit that the crossover is that we just need a bit of change in just to make sure that what we do naturally, we are also recording just to show that due diligence and that we are taking the steps needed.
Yeah. So on the back of that, Rosie has a follow-up question asking, so how often would you recommend carrying out an ERA on a contract work site? So 6 times, 8 times, 12 times?
Every time you use rodenticide, you'll need to provide a environmental risk assessment. If you're doing any work externally, it should be documented in a certain way. You can do like an environmental site survey at the start of, so if you take on a contract, you could do like a site survey, which is basically you walking around and just highlighting any risks that you may come up against. Then if you need to carry out a treatment in the future, you've already got a little bit of information. It's just a case of going out and making sure that information is still relevant and then documenting that on your environmental risk assessment for the treatment that you are carrying out at that time.
Oh, wonderful. So I don't think you touched on it too much on this course, but I know we had a previous talk with Sasa last month about birds being tested with the presence of AVKs, with them being bioaccumulative. Can you remember, I'm going to put you on the spot here, unfortunately. Can you remember the number that we looked at from the 80s to 2020 and actually the deaths associated in the last couple of years from AVKs? I remember it being something around, within the last 4 years, the number was really quite low, but a lot of it was involved with RTNs and...
Yeah, so the difference in change has been that now the industry, CRRU and other organizations such as SASA will test animals if they suspect residues. So like Niall mentioned, not everything is dying of rodenticides. I think in a 20-year period, I think there was like 700 buzzards. Not all of them died of rodenticides. Majority of them died of other causes. And there are also, the list is split between things like dogs and cats that live with humans, and also wild animals. So there's a bit of a split there as well. But the difference is that's changed is the approved pesticides that are being rodenticides that are being used in an approved way, so following the product label, is virtually zero incidents. And it seems to be, like I mentioned earlier, that the majority of rodenticide issues is through misuse of AVK. So that's people not following the product label and using it in environments where they shouldn't.
Wonderful. And so, if you're looking at doing your environmental risk assessment, what things would you be able to recommend people have on site to comply with that? Would it be the use of external boxes with traps already in place, either unset or not set, depending on the non-target? What sort of things would you recommend to those to help them with that hierarchy of control and maintaining, saying we've done everything we can, but now we need to use an AVK or similar rodenticide?
Yeah, so if you look at the CRRU document, it has, although the list isn't a structured list that you follow anymore, it is a list of steps that should be taken more as. When you go on a site and you start looking at your survey, think of the things that you could use around your rodenticide treatment. It might be if you've got mice activity outside, it's more likely going to be field mice or wood mice, so you're not going to use rodenticide. So you can start creating a picture of or a pattern of events where if you have this activity in this location, this would actually work. If you don't have, then you can maybe use something different. But follow the CRRU guidelines, make sure you understand that guidance document, and follow the steps that it suggests to take for your treatments within there is probably my best answer to that.
Wonderful. Davina's got a question
Yep.
about CRRU points we need per calendar year as per BPCA member. Do you just want to clarify that it's not a BPCA thing that this is, and this is an
Yeah.
industry
So
situation that we're in?
as an industry, you need 20 points a year. That 20 points can be made up of anything. So some of my points last year was through like health and safety, because I do a lot of work in education. I got some points from educational side as well, not just pest control. But the requirement now is out of that 20 points, 3 of them need to be CRRU approved training. That CRRU approved training is available. BPCA members, we're going to create them training courses for you to complete. It'll be a really simple step forward for us to do it. And then hopefully we're going to do that every year, so you know where to find that information. If you're not a BPCA member, you will need to go onto the Think Wildlife website and do the presentations on there. And it's just 3 points for CRRU, 17 points can be other things. If you like to do lots of training, you may get lots of points.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I think it's just clear to say that, yeah, it's not 20 plus 3, it is
Nope.
17 plus 3. So, but
Yeah,
your 3
it's
is
your,
your mandatory CRRU,
it's your minimum requirement.
which we'll be keeping an eye on if you are BPCA registered anyway, and keeping you up to date with those. Stuart's raised a question about the ERA being more directly contend with external baiting and burrow baiting treatment. So I think you probably covered that, but whether it's worth just reaffirming that for anyone who may not be.
Yeah, basically, if you're going to use a rodenticide, carrying out environmental risk assessment, follow the CRRU guidelines on how it should be documented and what information is required. Say, let's take a external rodent issue where you're going to use rodenticide. You need to have a site survey where it has all the information on there. That'll have a unique reference number. Your unique reference number will go on your environmental risk assessment form, and then you just need to fill out the environmental risk assessment form. If you go in the document, the CRRU document, there is an environmental risk assessment section. There is a number of bullet points. I think it's 7 or 8. In them bullet points, it tells you what is required to be in your environmental risk assessment. And like I say, it has some crossover between your report and your environmental risk assessment.